It's actually the book that the women will be starting for their women's group at the end of the month. This is the introduction. She begins her book with a quote, a short quote from Rumi that says, "Come to the root of yourself." And she goes on to say this: "If you pull up a plant in the garden, dig out a dandelion in the lawn, or find a shrub uprooted by a fierce wind, you will notice that each has a central support system called a taproot, from which other smaller roots develop. Trees also start with this kind of anchoring. Taproots provide stability, nourishment, and growth. When the poet Rumi encourages returning to the root of yourself, he refers to our spiritual taproot, the core of our very being, the dwelling place of divinity, the central source of goodness that grounds our existence. From my perspective, this essential self that Rumi encourages us to join consists of the abiding love reflected in the heart of Christ, a divine wisdom residing at the core of every being."
Reading this morning is from the book of Matthew, chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. After Jesus' birth, which happened in Bethlehem of Judea during the reign of Herod, astrologers from the east arrived in Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the newborn ruler of the Jews? We observed his star at its rising and have come to pay homage." At this news, Herod became greatly disturbed, as did all of Jerusalem. Summoning all the chief priests and religious scholars of the people, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. "In Bethlehem of Judea," they informed him. "Here's what the prophet has written. And you, Bethlehem, land of Judah, are by no means least among the leaders of Judah, since from you will come a leader who is to shepherd my people Israel." Herod called the astrologers aside and found out from them the exact time of the star's appearance. Then he sent them to Bethlehem after having instructed them, "Go and get detailed information about the child. When you have found him, report back to me, so that I may go and offer a homage too." After their audience with the ruler, they set out. The star which they had observed at its rising went ahead of them until it came to a standstill over the place where the child lay. They were overjoyed at seeing the star, and upon entering the house, found the child with Mary, his mother. They prostrated themselves and paid homage. Then they opened their coffers and presented the child with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. They were warned in a dream not to return to Herod, so they went back to their own country by another route.
Would you pray with me? Ground of our being, as we move into this new year, help us to go with eyes wide open, with hearts ready to receive, with minds alive and seeking. Help us together to move forward in joy and hope, seeking wisdom and insight. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of each of our hearts be filled with your light and your goodness. Amen. So I'm guessing many of you have, if not all of us, have either read a book or seen a movie where the opening scene for a little while is a flashback, right? They flash back to something that happened to the main character, tell you a story of some kind, and then take you 20, 50, some odd years in the future, right? But that original story was to set the scene for what's going on in the character's later life, or the country's later life, or whatever. It's called a parabolic overture. A parabolic overture. This way of setting the scene by going back in time. So when we look at the book, the Gospel of Matthew, Matthew does this very thing in the first 2 chapters. They're a parabolic overture. They're a story to set the scene for Jesus' ministry. In those first 2 chapters, part of which Racine read for us, the beginning starts with the genealogy of Jesus, from Joseph through David back to Abraham. And then we have Mary, the young girl who's engaged to Joseph, who happens to turn up pregnant. And Joseph isn't too keen about it, and so he decides he's going to divorce her, which is really interesting language because they're not fully wed yet. But in that day and age, if you were engaged to someone, it was a legal contract. And if someone committed adultery, the only way out of that contract was death or divorce. So Joseph talks about divorcing her quietly until he gets this dream from an angel. Says, don't do that. Jesus is going to be really cool. We want him around. And then we have the story of the astrologers, or the magi, and how they come from a distant land following a star and seek out a new king of the Jews. And they go to Herod because we got to get the evil villain in somehow. It sort of reminds me of the Disney movie, right? Where there's got to be that evil villain who's looking to destroy everything and says, oh, really? There's a new king born. I'd like to bring them gifts by myself. Why don't you come back and tell me exactly where that new king is so that I can bring them gifts? And all of the rest of us are like, no, don't do it, right? So that was Herod's role. So they find the baby. They impart their gifts. They're warned in a dream not to go back to Herod. Joseph and family are warned in a dream to flee, and they flee to Egypt. And what wasn't part of what was read was the order of Herod to have all children 2 and under killed, just in case there really was a new king of the Jews, right? And recognize that this probably took place when Jesus was about 2 years old, and they were living in a house in Bethlehem. So completely different from Luke's version, right? A parabolic overture. If we look at it from that standpoint, instead of trying to make sense of the difference between Matthew and Luke and did these things really happen, if we say, okay, as a parabolic overture, what's important to Matthew? What's important that we learn? What do we need to understand? What meaning, purpose is the author of Matthew trying to impart? And we could have a really, really long discussion on this, but just briefly, so you've got a little background and insight, because maybe just because I find it fascinating and I'm a geek. So we have the lineage, the genealogy in there, so that we're clear, and Matthew's audience is clear, that Jesus was of royal lineage of David. Right? Because that was important. King David was the be-all, end-all of kings, and they were waiting for another one. So the second one is that God was in every piece of that story, through the dreams. And so we have this sense that God's present, and God has a hand in this very important time. Right? We have kings, magi, astrologers, probably a better translation, who come from really far away, who are not Jewish, but are seeking the king of the Jews, which is fascinating. But metaphorically, it's important to say these people who aren't Jewish also saw Jesus as their king, as someone who was important to their lives. At the end of Matthew, Jesus says in his final little speech, go and make disciples of all nations. So it's a framing. We start with some non-Jews, and we end with continue to go forth outside of our own bounds, right? So we also have this set, if you get really into this, you can go back and read the story of Moses. If you read the story of Moses and read the first 2 chapters of Matthew, you will see a lot of parallels and that Jesus becomes almost the new Moses. And if you had been raised a Jew and you were very familiar with the Hebrew Scriptures, you would automatically see some of these parallels. And it made Jesus a little more accessible in those ways. So all kinds of really fascinating things to be put in there, including, and perhaps not least important, is the fact that he's hailed King of the Jews. And yet Herod right now is King of the Jews. So it sets up this conflict, this inherent conflict at the very beginning between Rome and Jesus. And that conflict continues through his life, and as we know, Rome ends up killing him at the end of his life. But it sets the stage for where that conflict starts. After chapter 2, we jump 30 years into the future. Okay, parabolic overture is done. We are now in the future, and we have the baptism and ministry of Jesus, and we go forward. But there are a lot of important pieces in those first couple chapters. What I want to talk about today is what I said with the kids, seeking. The concept that the astrologers, metaphorically, were seeking for a long, long time, left everything that they knew, and followed a random star. Kind of got me thinking, because I've seen some of these signs on people's lawns that say, wise men still seek him. Have you seen any of those signs? Mm-hmm. There's one in our neighborhood, and their garage door is like this whole nativity scene in, full color with the real life looking people. And I wondered to myself, they've got that manger scene up with the kings who are already there, which is not in the story. And I find myself thinking, what exactly do they think they are meaning when they put up that sign that says, wise men still seek him? I tried really hard, first of all, not to be offended by the sign, because I don't know where all the wise women are. We already found them. We asked for directions, brought a casserole, and maybe some diapers, right? So, what do people seek when they say wise men still seek him? Are they still seeking a baby in a manger like is on their garage door? Are they seeking a grown-up Jesus with some wisdom and some things to teach? Are they seeking a king like the astrologers? Are they seeking, I don't know, something completely different? And then I wonder about us. What are we seeking spiritually? What are you seeking? And this is not like a one-size-fits-all. What do you seek spiritually these days? Peace. Inner peace?
Yeah, in the midst of a whole lot of not peace.
In the midst of a lot of not peace. Yeah. What else? Understanding of
Everything.
everything. Yeah, I get that. Is that what you were saying,
Yeah.
Sharon? Understanding.
Acceptance,
Acceptance of
what is,
what is. Carol,
where we fit in all of that.
where we fit. And by all of that, you mean just life in general?
Where we are right now in this world, in our neighborhood, in our families, in our church.
Where do we fit in every piece of our lives, our neighborhoods, our families, our churches, our communities, Jan?
I'm seeking to see the good and the God in every other person. And sometimes that's really a challenge, but I'm seeking it.
Yeah, good. So to seek God, to see the good in every person. And the challenge of that is sometimes, Marianne?
to love.
To love. Stan, are you really that hard to love? Just To general, you mean, Marianne?
To be loved and to give love. Yeah.
To be loved and to give love. Mike?
Well, I'll try to walk in somebody else's shoes and not judge and say, you know, what are they going through? How are they feeling?
But to walk in someone else's shoes, to say, to not judge.
More or less what we can do.
To seek what your place, again, sort of what Carol said, what can I do now in this place, in this time?
Seeking how I can help other people and not become oblivious or have like blinders on and not see what see a person that needs help and not walk past and ask.
So to seek how to be more cognizant and aware of people in need around you, and not, and be willing to step up and do something.
We do to the least of
To do under the least of these is, yeah, absolutely. Those are a lot of amazing spiritual seeking quests. There's a story about Rabbi Baruch and his son Yehiel. And Yehiel was playing hide and seek with his friends one day. And he went to hide, and he hid, and he hid, and he hid, and nobody ever came to find him. And finally he came out, and he discovered that his friends had gone up and started doing something else. And he was just distraught and crying, and he went to his grandpa and told him that, you know, he'd been hiding, and his friends had forgotten all about him, and his grandpa, a rabbi, you know, took him up on his knee and gave him a hug, and with a tear in his own eye, he said, you know, God says that sometimes. I hide and people won't come find me. I was reading Philip Gulley's Substack this week. He's a Quaker pastor. And he said that each year in the U.S., 7,000 churches close. And every month, 1,500 pastors choose to seek a different way to earn a living. Now, I don't know where he gets his numbers, but I'm going to trust him enough to say he would have done his best to be accurate about that. And that's a lot. And I find myself wondering if people are still seeking God in any way, shape, or form, in the ways that you described, in the way of seeking a deeper spiritual understanding about ourselves, to evolve spiritually, to understand the movement of love in the universe. Are people still seeking, or are they just plain giving up? You know, I have a feeling many of you know folks who've stopped going to church. Have they stopped seeking the spiritual? Or is it something else? Why did they stop going? I talked to, and you can think about that for a second and answer me if you want. Number of years ago, I happened to be back at the church in Brookfield that I had been a student at, that I actually came out of, United Methodist Church. And I was talking to the pastor who was there at the time. And he was a couple years away from retirement. And I was a young pastor. This must have been 20 years ago, right? And he told me that he couldn't wait to retire because he really didn't believe it anymore. And I looked at him and I said, well, how do you get up there every Sunday and preach and teach about something that you don't believe? I said, why don't you just go and do something else? Which I understand a little better now that I'm older. But because it's not that easy to just say, I put in 20, 30 years in this profession, and he was just trying to hang on until he could retire in a couple of years. Because he was within a denomination that didn't even allow him really to seek, as far as I could tell. It was a, here's what you're supposed to believe, let me gift wrap that for you and give it to you. And I think he got stuck, couldn't grow, couldn't evolve, couldn't change, and so there is nothing left to seek, and he just couldn't wait to be done. Do we seek? And what do we seek? You know, so many of you, I am so pleased that you know what you're seeking, or, you know, given some thought who you want to be and how you want to be, and that it is a spiritual quest for you. Because it's so important, I think, to our wholeness. So, how many of you do New Year's resolutions? A couple of you? How many of you used to do them when you were younger? So why have we given up?
They don't come true.
They don't come true? That's a wish, not a resolution.
Typically, they're pointless and most people fail.
I don't even know that they're pointless. I mean, exercising more, or losing weight, or saving some money, or whatever, are all, they can be really good things. But resolutions are about something we have to do or not do, right? And so often, sorry Sandy, but we fail. Maybe if you got a genie who's not coming true for you right now, but
Resolution, we don't have, most people don't put in an action plan.
right, you need an action plan, and some people do. I mean, you know, like the stats of how many people join a health club in January is huge. So it's a partial plan. It's the follow-through that I think a lot of people slack off on. We do really good for a week, and then that was just too hard. So Carrie Newcomer, who I've mentioned a number of times because I really enjoy her writing, wrote on New Year's Day. She said, what if this year we had a revolution for ourselves instead of a resolution? What if we thought about ways to move into the new year, or had the intention to move into the new year, seeking new perspectives, new ways of seeing, new ways of thinking, sort of like, you know, the astrologers being willing to go forth following a star to see what there is to see. Instead of having a hardcore, I have to do this in my life in the next 6 months. I want to read 20 books or something. To say, I want a new way of understanding. I want to continue to seek peace. I want to continue to be open-minded and non-judgmental. For the last couple of years, I'm sure I've said this at some point, instead of having a resolution, I've picked a word or a phrase that's been mine for the year. So like 2 years ago, it was, I can't control anyone else. And sometimes I can't even control myself. But I can't control anybody else. Last year, the word was acceptance. Going into this year, I think it's let go. Not completely sold on that, but I'm pretty sure it's let go for this year. But I can tell you that just having that word to come back to in different situations made a difference. Remember, Kaye, your word for the year is let go. Right? And it gives a different perspective. It's not a resolution necessarily, but it's a revolution in how I think. And so, you know, I encourage you to think about whether you have a word or a phrase that you want to guide you through the new year, to guide you in a revolution of thought and thinking and perspective. Let me read to you just a little of what Carrie Newcomer wrote, because maybe that concept will make a little more sense. So what might happen if instead of focusing on resolving an old problem, we decided to intentionally open up our minds to a whole new way of thinking? What might change if we did as Rilke described and truly welcomed the new year full of things that have never been? What might happen if I decided to not just focus on how to keep working with the well-worn grooves of the path before me, but rather consider what has always held true at the very center of my journey? What true things I keep circling around as the earth orbits the sun? What I mean is, what if I listen to what sings at the center of my heart? What endures and against all odds? What helps me to see that there is still a path, but it may look different than anything I've imagined until now? Sort of talks about that root of the root of our soul, that taproot, to try and return to that, but revolution instead of evolution. So I offer that to you for whatever it's worth this morning. And as we go forward in the next number of weeks, we've talked about seeking. I want to talk about finding for a number of weeks, the different ways we can find the divine in and around us. Ways that perhaps we don't often think about, through conversation, through vulnerability, through deep listening, through a few other things that I can't remember at the moment, but they're there. So, welcome to the new year.